One of the most difficult concepts for modern Americans to understand, and one that's really quite essential to understanding the world of the founders, and in particular the period between the American Revolution and the Constitution, is the centrality of the idea of civic virtue. Now, in contemporary America, you have to sort of ask yourself the question, when was the last time you heard someone described as virtuous? It's not a term that we hear a lot in modern America, and indeed, most people, when they would hear the word virtue, would almost certainly tend to think about personal or private virtues. The virtue that we're talking about when we're trying to understand the political and constitutional universe that gave us the American Constitution is a different concept, civic virtue. And it comes to us from a very long tradition going back to ancient Rome, a tradition that the founders were very well aware of. And the idea behind civic virtue is that citizenship has certain obligations that are attached to it. Citizens both enjoy rights and liberties, but they have civic obligations. And among them are the participating in the jury, serving in the militia, and of course, depending on whether or not you are propertied or unpropertied, participating in the political process at the level that the society allows you to participate. So, of course, in the 18th century, we're still dealing with a world where the assumption is the landed interest is different than people without land, and in most of the colonies, and certainly in most of the states, you have, with the exception of Pennsylvania and Vermont, bicameral, which is to say upper houses and lower houses, to serve in the upper house and to vote for people in the upper house, there's almost always a higher property requirement. And apart from Pennsylvania, virtually all of the other states have some kind of property requirement even to vote for the lower house. Pennsylvania, which is arguably the most democratic of the new states, does away with the property requirement, and it's a tax-paying requirement. Which is quite progressive for its day. So participation in the political process, that's one of the key ideas behind civic virtue. And the other key idea is that you must put the good of the Commonwealth. I mean, Massachusetts this day is still called the Commonwealth, and that idea carries with it the notion of the collective good of the society and the political community. And so the idea is that you as a citizen, and particularly if you're a leader, you must think beyond your own narrow self-interest. You must even think beyond the narrow interest of your community. You must think of the good of the entire political community when you act in a public capacity. Now, in terms of understanding this concept of virtue, as is often the case, there's a kind of balance between virtue on the one hand, which is the value to be encouraged, and corruption, which is the negative opposite of virtue, that is the ever-present danger that republics face. And the founders are very aware, because they've studied the history of Rome, and they have studied the experience of other republican governments, and essentially going back to their studies of Roman history, what they are aware of is that republics are like people, in that they have a cycle of life that they go through. And republics start out young and energetic and vigorous and virtuous. They become wealthy and perhaps a little complacent in middle age. And at the end, they become corrupt and weak, and invariably they perish. So what the founders are deeply aware of and very concerned about is, can we build a republic that will stand the test of time? Will we fall the way Rome fell? Will we find some way to actually beat the clock, as it were? Because they're very aware that there's been no successful Republican government that has ultimately stood the test of time. Now, if you think about it, the Massachusetts Constitution, which is 1780, it's not one of the first constitutions of the period. It's actually one of the last of the Revolutionary era. The Massachusetts Constitution is the oldest continuously functioning constitution in the world. The second oldest, of course, is the United States Constitution. Now, of course, both of those have had changes, but the fundamental framework that they set up continues to define our political and legal system. And in that sense, of course, what the founders did is generally credited to be a great success. Obviously, in contemporary America, we have some concerns that there are some dysfunctions, there's gridlock, there's some concerns that maybe some of the customs that have developed in the Senate, for instance, may be subverting the founders' vision of what the Senate was supposed to accomplish. Certainly they did not expect political parties when they wrote the Constitution, and the fact that political parties have been with us for a very long time indeed, the system has had to adapt to that. And of course, we no longer have property requirements. So we are living in a republic that has been democratized in many ways, and trying to figure out how you make this structure, which was given to us by an 18th century set of leaders, can flourish in the 21st century is, of course, what the problem that we as Americans face today. Here's, in my mind, one of the greatest expressions of how important virtue was to the founders. When Thomas Jefferson is in France as America's representative, he goes to the south of France and he sees one of the most important surviving examples of Roman architecture, the Maison Carrée in Nîmes, France. He writes a letter back, and in that letter, he says that gazing upon this building, you would have thought that he was a lovesick teenager looking upon his true love's desire. Now, of course, the fascinating thing about Jefferson is, if you read his letters to women, by and large, they don't spark much heat or passion. And there are a few exceptions. And of course, he did destroy the letters he wrote to his wife, which probably were very passionate. But by and large, when he talks about architecture, he gets very steamy. So it's funny when you come across a letter by Jefferson and it's really, it's very intense. And then you realize, oh, he's talking about a building that's captured his imagination. And so the Maison Carrée is that building for Jefferson, and he's absolutely convinced that the future of Virginia, the entire fate of the Republic, rests on the new state capital that they're going to build in Richmond, Virginia, must embody the principles that he sees embodied in this Roman temple. It must be pure Roman simplicity. And so if you were to go down to Richmond today, you would see that, in fact, the Virginia state capitol, which of course has been expanded, but is fundamentally a Roman temple sitting on a hill. And Jefferson really believed that architecture had a role to uplift the people and remind them of basic values, and the values that he believed Virginians had to be reminded of were these values of Roman republicanism. What's fascinating, if you think about it, the building that we now call Independence Hall, which 18th century Americans would have called the Philadelphia State House, which is the building that dominates the skyline of 18th century Philadelphia, it is an example of Palladian architecture. It's an example of an English style that draws from the Italian Renaissance. It would sometimes be called Georgian, but given that it's the home of where the Declaration of Independence is written, calling it Georgian seems a bit ironic in terms of the architecture, so I think we continue to call it Palladian. But it is the perfect embodiment of mid-18th century English architectural style. Has certain classical features, but it's mostly red brick, and it combines the best of sort of modern, in a sense, modern 18th century architectural styles with a hint of classicism. Jefferson rejects that style. He wants to return to pure Roman classicism, and that's what he gets in the Virginia state capitol. Now, sitting in, or I should say not sitting, it's actually standing in the Virginia state capitol is a statue that was commissioned of George Washington. And the statue, which is somewhat larger than life, a version of it actually sits out in front of the Society of Cincinnati national headquarters at Anderson House here in Washington, D.C. And indeed, the Society has a beautiful miniature version of it, which we'll talk about in a moment. The idea of Cincinnatus, that Washington is the modern Cincinnatus, is, I think, another beautiful expression of how the revolutionary generation is deeply steeped in these Roman ideals, and in particular has taken the idea of civic virtue as a foundational principle. So Cincinnatus, who is Cincinnatus? Cincinnatus is the Roman general who leaves his farm to defend the Roman Republic, and when he is done with his job, he returns to his plow and becomes a citizen again and a farmer. The antithesis of kind of the idea of Cincinnatus, of course, is Caesar. This is the Roman general who crosses the Rubicon, who enters the city armed, and who seizes power and subverts the republic. So in a way, 18th century Americans are trying to understand politics as a kind of dichotomy where we want to encourage Cincinnatus-like behavior and we want to prevent the dangers of Caesar-like behavior. And so they commission a great French sculptor, Houdon, to make this great statue, and the statue is filled with wonderful symbolic references to the ideal of civic virtue and Washington's remarkable embodiment of that great modern virtue. Washington becomes the modern Cincinnatus, the American Cincinnatus. So what does that mean? Cincinnatus, of course, is the great Roman general who starts as a private citizen, a farmer. The Republic has need of his military services. He leaves his farm. He defends the Republic. Once the danger is over, he returns to private life, to being a farmer. He always puts the good of the Republic ahead of his own private self-interest. The sculptor, in creating Washington as the modern Cincinnatus, has placed a plow, symbol of sort of an agrarian farmer. Washington is dressed in his military attire, but interestingly enough, Washington's military role, the sculptor has very cleverly communicated that in a republic, in the kind of modern Cincinnatus, who is the figure of virtue in the American Republic, civilian authority controls military authority. And so how does the artist do that? We have here the symbol of Roman law, the fasci, which in the case of the modern republic, the United States, has 13 rods, symbolic of the 13 different states. This word fasci, of course, was corrupted by Mussolini in the 20th century for fascism, but its original Roman meaning is tied to the idea of the rule of law. And you'll note also that Washington's sword, the symbol of his command, of his military authority, rests on the symbol of civilian law, the fasci. So we have a reinforcement of the idea that the rule of law, that republicanism, no man is above the law, including Cincinnatus and Washington, and that military figures always take orders from civilian authority. That's what makes us a republic and not a tyranny. Several of the state declarations of rights, the bills of rights that are adopted, and a number of states, even before they write their constitutions, even before they say anything about how the legislature will be elected, what the executive will look like, they preface their constitutional documents with declarations of rights. Of course, our modern Constitution has what we call a Bill of Rights, but it comes after the body of the Constitution because those ideas were added as amendments after they had written the structure of government. In the state constitutions, it's the other way around. They put the Declaration of Rights first. Now, in several of them, including Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, the three examples I know best, each of them includes a provision that reads something like the following: no free republic can maintain the blessings of liberty without a commitment to virtue, moderation, and frugality. Now, if you think about that, it's quite remarkable that in a Declaration of Rights, a Bill of Rights, something that in the modern context we usually think as a restraint on government, they write into it an obligation on citizens. And they put it in there, using it almost as an instrument in the same way that a provision saying that the government can't limit your practicing your religion, they put in the citizens must remember to return to first principles and act virtuously. They put that in there in the same sense that that is also a restraint on tyranny and power. But it's a restraint on tyranny and power that relies on citizens taking certain kinds of actions. One of the most important concepts of virtue is the idea of military service, the idea that we must, particularly with the militia ideal, that citizen soldiers are essential to the preservation of the republic, to protect its liberty, and that participation in this process helps inculcate virtue in the citizenry. So it's hugely important. And one of the most dramatic and quite remarkable visual representations of this from the Revolutionary era is a remarkable painting by John Trumbull, The Death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Battle of Bunker Hill, of course, one of the early battles in the American Revolution. The British were expecting to dispatch these ragtag bunch of militiamen, although they eventually do take the hill, but they take it at a great cost, and the Americans really vindicate the idea of the militia, and it's generally considered to be, in a certain sense, a victory for both sides. In the most narrow sense, the British take the hill, but the Americans do so much better than anyone would have expected that it's also accounted a great victory for American military forces. Now, looking at this remarkable painting, Trumbull, who is one of the great artists of the Revolutionary era, wants to capture the spirit of the age. And the greatest kind of painting to do that is a history painting. Now, Trumbull, like his predecessor Benjamin West, another great American artist, is instrumental in transforming this genre, history painting. Traditionally, history paintings were thought to be things you could do of classical antiquity or Bible scenes, that nothing in the modern era could possibly live up to the greatness of those two moments. And both of those painters are instrumental in saying, no, we live in remarkable times, and what we are doing today is of tremendous historical import. And so the other thing they do is that they portray them realistically. So for instance, some of the first efforts to break out of the ancient or biblical versions of history paintings sets modern figures but dresses them up in classical garb. What's great about West's paintings of the French and Indian War and now Trumbull's painting of the American Revolution is these are people dressed in the appropriate military garb of their day. And this dramatic image with this canvas, you've got the darkness on one side, the light on the other. It's a dramatic moment. General Warren, one of the heroes of the Revolution, is dying. The pose that he rests in is one of the most famous in all of Western art. It's the Pietà position of Christ at the bottom of the cross, being cradled, of course, in classical, in Western art, it would usually be Mary. Here, it's one of his military associates. So he has made the ultimate sacrifice, and it's both a kind of civic republican emblem of virtue, and it's linked up to a kind of religious tradition of Christian sacrifice. Now, what's really quite remarkable is Trumbull was also a very shrewd businessman. He wanted to produce engravings of this, one of which the Society of Cincinnati has, and which you'll be seeing on the screen. And he thought that, like a good businessman, wouldn't it be great if I could sell it on both sides of the Atlantic? Wouldn't it be great if I could sell it to the English as well as the Americans? And in order to do that, he does something quite remarkable. At the very center of the painting, you'll notice that there's a British officer who's reaching out with his hand to stay the bayonet from delivering the final mortal blow. So this suggests that virtue knows no national bounds, that anyone is capable of displaying this quality of virtue, that even though we are militarily opposed to the British and we are fighting against them, the British people are not our enemy. They are capable of the same kinds of heroic and virtuous activity that we are. A nice universal message, and of course doubles his sales because he can now sell it on both sides of the Atlantic. So it's good business and it's a good moral message. So more power to John Trumbull for recognizing that. Now, it's a dramatic scene. It's the chaos of war. Warren has made the ultimate sacrifice. And what's very interesting, and has drawn the attention of some recent historians, art historians, is what's going on in the margins of the painting. So let me just talk to you about that because it is kind of fascinating. So if you look at the margins of the painting, and if we had the actual painting in front of us, it would be a little bit more dramatic. There's an African-American figure who's sort of hidden by an American soldier. And if you stare really, really hard in the middle of that chaos, there's actually another African-American figure who's sort of a kind of disembodied head. We don't even see his body. What art historians have noted is we know from the social history that there were a number of African Americans serving in the militia who fought courageously that day. And there's speculation that at least one of those African Americans may be responsible for the shot that kills Major Pitcairn, the man who's falling backward and being held by two British officers right behind the officer who is saving Warren from the final blow. Pitcairn leads the attack on Concord, so he is in some ways a villain in American history. And there's at least some speculation that he was killed by one of the African-American soldiers, militiamen serving that day, yet there's no sign of that from the painting. And literally, the African Americans are literally marginalized. They literally are placed at the margin of the painting. And again, there's a lot of discussion about why that's the case. One explanation is the actual history as it played out, if you're an artist, is sometimes less persuasive from an artistic point of view than an invented history that conforms to people's expectations. So since the expectation would be that this would mostly be fought by white American militiamen, placing an African American prominently would have maybe drawn too much attention. But of course, sometimes the actual history and the mythic history are not in complete accord. So he makes the decision to, at least with regard to the African American figures, to go with the mythic story, which makes them more marginal than in fact they actually were. So I think the painting is a great teaching tool in that sense, because it both illustrates this idea of virtue, shows us something of the chaos of battle, shows us something about the nature of art and the democratization of art, and shows us how racial attitudes are very subtly encoded in a work of art. And so I think it's a very rich visual source for understanding the Revolutionary era. So what kinds of actions are citizens supposed to take? Well, clearly they're supposed to understand these ideas of civic virtue. They're supposed to participate in politics. They're supposed to put the good of the republic ahead of any selfish interests they may have. Now, one of the most remarkable examples of civic virtue in action also deals with George Washington, and it's the story of the Newburgh Conspiracy, which is really one of the most remarkable moments in the Revolutionary era. One of the biggest problems that America has, of course, is paying for its new army and paying for a war in which it's fighting the most powerful nation on earth, Great Britain. And everyone recognizes that the states are not doing enough to help Washington and his army, that collecting taxes and providing funds for the army is always much slower than it should be. And the Continental Army Officers Corps, which is camped outside New York in Newburgh, there's unrest that's brewing. They're dissatisfied with this weak government, which isn't functioning effectively. These are some of the best and the brightest, most talented, and some of the wealthiest people in America. They're beginning to think, why don't we just take over because we can do it better? And of course, this is the classic temptation, going back to ancient sources, that even people who are generally good will sometimes be tempted to think, let's forget about the law. Let's just bypass all the procedures and let's just get to where we want, because the end will justify the means. One of the most fundamental philosophical questions that anyone or any society poses. How do you balance the ends and the means? So there is serious talk that the officers will rebel. There'll be a coup. They will seize control. We see this happen all over the world, where military leaders subvert civilian governments, establish dictatorships. Caesarism. I mean, it's one of the oldest models in Western political thought, and in the modern world, not uniquely Western by any stretch. Washington learns of this and is deeply troubled. So he rides up to Newburgh, New York, and he has a letter from Congress saying that they're going to do their very best to do better and to meet the needs of the Army and to pay the Officers Corps eventually, provide them with the pensions they've been promised. He addresses the Officers Corps in this makeshift tent they've created, which they themselves have dubbed the Temple of Virtue. And Washington gets up before the Continental Army Officers Corps, and he's going to read a letter, and he has some prefatory remarks he's going to make. And he pauses, and he reaches into his pocket for his glasses, and he says to the assembled crowd, "Gentlemen, you'll have to excuse me. I have grown gray in the service of my country. I fear perhaps I'm going blind too." And then he delivers this appeal of camaraderie, of having suffered together and bled together and fought together and sacrificed together, and how now is not the time to abandon that type of virtuous legacy that they've created and that bond that they've created together. People are weeping. The officers' corps, we have testimonials and memoirs where people say they literally were brought to tears, and there were many, as one says, many an eye was glistened with a tear listening to the Commander-in-Chief, Washington, address them. So if you think about that, it is still just quite remarkable that Washington, by virtue of his charisma, by virtue of the fact that he is perceived really to be the selfless leader, the modern Cincinnatus, the man who has, who led a comfortable life as a very wealthy Virginian planter, but who puts it aside to do what must be done for Virginia and for the United States. The fact that he has come before his officers and who have a close connection with him and pleaded with them to do the right thing and invoke his own suffering, growing gray, his eyesight is no longer good. He reduces them to tears, and he essentially crushes the rebellion by reaching into his pocket for his glasses, which is a gravitas, I think, that we have not seen in American politics in a very long time. Perhaps we'll never see it again. Fortunately, we saw it then, and it put us on this road to republicanism when we might have ended up with a military junto seizing power. And again, it only makes sense in this society where everyone understands this concept of civic virtue. One might think that, okay, civic virtue, they write it into their declarations of rights, they build their state capitals with these Roman models, but how far is this idea really trickling down into society? Like, for instance, women, are they swept up into this idea of virtue? Well, we have some very interesting sources on that. One of the things the American Revolution does is it encourages an expansion in education. And at least for white women, there are new opportunities to be educated. Obviously, those opportunities are not as expansive as today. They don't include university. But a number of new female academies spring up after the American Revolution. And one of them in Rhode Island has produced a remarkable set of primary sources of a very unique kind for us. There are a series of needlework samplers that the girls did, because of course needlework is something an 18th century woman would have needed to master, particularly one who is middling or upper middling in terms of their economic position. And while before the war, these needlework samplers had all these domestic themes, animals, homes, boys and girls walking, sitting under trees, a whole series of them produced after the Revolution. Suddenly, there are still animals, there are still boys and girls, but if you look closely, some new things are in the middle of the sampler. So in one case, the girl has stitched in, instead of a kind of traditional homey homily, she has stitched in the words, "Let virtue be a guide to thee." And instead of her house or some kind of domestic dwelling, she's put the Rhode Island State House, the center of politics, and Providence College, the forerunner of Brown University, and the top above what is now Brown University basically encourages students to gain education, to become educated so that they can exercise their political judgment in a way consistent with virtue. So here you have a teenage girl, who in 21st century America would probably not, in terms of, what would you be doing in your education or even for fun, would not be creating a civic republican text done in needlework. I mean, I don't want to say nobody's done it in contemporary America. Probably someone is doing it somewhere even as I speak. But the fact that we have several of these, that this was obviously not a unique thing, that even these teenage girls were being inculcated with these ideas of civic virtue are clearly evidenced in this remarkable set of sources, which are needlework samplers. I mean, these are not, published political texts. These are something that it's a female art form, and it's a female art form that has imbibed certain of these political and legal and constitutional ideals. We have other examples. There's a math book for a young girl named Martha Ryan, and on the front of her little cipher book, which is what we would call the math book, she has a flag, and she's written the words "liberty or death as the preface to her arithmetic homework. Again, you're seeing political themes finding their way into places that you wouldn't have necessarily thought them. One of the first spellers, children's books of verse, if you were to look up the page with the letter E, it would have the symbol, the Great Seal of the United States, the eagle. And if you think about the Great Seal of the United States with its symbol, it's got an eagle carrying arrows and an olive branch, symbol of war and peace. It's got a kind of shield across its front, which again symbolizes the protective function of the new United States. So you're seeing these patriotic and nationalistic themes also work their way into a children's spelling book. You also, if you went to one of the finer cabinet makers in Massachusetts, when he started making furniture, instead of making little elegant designs on the top, which had been typical of 18th century furniture, of sort of the Chippendale style, you start seeing things like the Goddess of Liberty, carrying a liberty pole with a liberty hat on it, carved into the middle of people's dressers. And you see a lot of American eagles starting to appear at the bottom of mirrors and things like that. So the entire culture, from its material culture, from its education, to its public buildings, to its constitutional texts, all reflect this same Republican set of values. And virtue is one of those key concepts.